So for my IAP project, I decided to do throwing a football on the run. My goal is for my participants to be able to throw on the run and complete 50 to 70% of their throws, and showing for the 5 critical features that I'll be showing now with the expert model. With this expert model, we get to start off with seeing one of the critical features, which is hip lateral rotation to approximately 45 degrees and hip flexion to 30 to 40 degrees. This is what I consider getting depth on their sprint. We will also get to see now what I call stepping into their throw and getting the ball up. This includes knee flexion and hip flexion when stepping into their throw, and shoulder abduction and external rotation when getting that ball up to be ready to throw. In this following vantage point, we get to see the following 2 critical features. We started off with elbow flexion to approximately 100 degrees. That is what I consider to be securing the ball when running. It's important to secure the ball because in a game situation, we don't want the defender to be able to cause us to fumble. So we see that here. And the final critical feature that I chose was pretty much the follow through. So following through with your throw, which includes radial ulnar pronation to approximately 120 and elbow extension back to neutral, as we get to see now in the expert model. For our first video session, we had our participant Julian. Julian, as we can see in that video, he has several weaknesses. He has hip lateral rotation and flexion weakness, elbow flexion, shoulder external rotation and abduction, and hip and knee flexion. So he did mention to me that he played baseball before, which explains why he is bringing some of those baseball mechanics over to throwing a football. So we have to get him ready to transition, to throwing a football and not a baseball. His one strength, though, was his follow through, which was the pronation and extension. Now with George, he used to play football and he used to be a quarterback, so we see less weaknesses with him. We start off with his strengths, which is the elbow extension, shoulder external rotation, and abduction, as well with pronation and extension. So George mentioned to me that he was taught to throw on the run, which is why we see one of his weaknesses being the hip and knee flexion. And he didn't get a bunch of depth on his to start, so we also categorized hip lateral rotation and flexion as his weakness. Now, Miguel, he never had touched a football in his life. So we see several weaknesses here with hip lateral rotation and flexion, elbow extension, hip and knee flexion, as well with shoulder external rotation and abduction. He mentioned that there was one time in high school that his PE teacher just had everyone in class throw a football. So that's probably the only time he threw a football. So we have a lot to work with Miguel. But one strength that he did show was the pronation and extension, which is his follow through, as we get to see now. But again, we have a lot of sessions, so Miguel will get better at this. Our first instructional session, I decided to do exaggeration, which helps them with the hip and knee flexion as well with the shoulder abduction and external rotation. We see it here with Julian demonstrating. So because of that, in the second session, we already see improvements with each participant. As we see here with Julian, some of the weaknesses again are still hip lateral rotation and flexion and that elbow flexion. He is not securing the ball, as you can tell. He is running with it in one hand. But thanks to the drill that we just did, we see Julian move one of the weaknesses to strengths, which is the hip and knee flexion, as we see now, and also the shoulder abduction and external rotation. So with George, he pretty much has, I want to say, all the strength, well, 4 out of the 5 critical features as strengths. He has elbow flexion, shoulder abduction, and external rotation. He improved on his hip and knee flexion, which is now a strength, and obviously his pronation and extension, which he had before in session 1. Just the one weakness that we have with him is the hip lateral rotation and flexion, which is, again, what I consider getting depth. But we have not really talked about this at this point, so he will get better, and we'll see some drills in the following video. With Miguel, he still has a couple weaknesses, which I will demonstrate in the slow-mo. His weaknesses are his hip lateral rotation and flexion, which is getting depth, and his elbow flexion securing the ball. Besides that, this drill that we did of exaggeration with Miguel, it really helped him out with the hip and knee flexion, as well with the external rotation of the shoulder and abduction of the shoulder, which we now categorize in the strengths. We see here he is setting his feet up, hip and knee flexion, external rotation, and shoulder abduction, which, to be honest with you, this drill really helped him out the most out of all the participants. In the second instructional session, I decided to do manual guidance to demonstrate to them where I wanted their elbows flexed to be able to secure the ball when running. And we see in the third session that Julian, he already demonstrates that as a strength. So his elbow flexion is now a strength, as long with his hip and knee flexion, shoulder abduction and external rotation, and his pronation and extension. So here in the video, we get to see that that elbow is flexed and he has that ball secured with two hands, which was a weakness of him, as we remember in the second video. He was running with the ball with one hand. And again, Julian met 4 out of the 5 critical features already by this week. And one weakness is the hip lateral rotation, which we haven't really discussed. George, again, he used to play football, so he picked everything up pretty quick. He continues with his 4 out of the 5 strengths of the critical features. And the one weakness that he does have is that hip lateral rotation and flexion. But again, I have not discussed it at this point. We will definitely see drills in the upcoming video. He has great ball security, hip and knee flexion, shoulder external rotation, and his follow through, which is the pronation, is perfect. Miguel, he's getting there. He still needs some work. He's really been working hard. One thing that was interesting to me in this session was that Miguel's strengths were his elbow flexion, which was protecting the ball, which we literally just had a session for. He had his shoulder abduction and external rotation, and his follow through, pronation and extension. But if you notice, there's one less strength here. It went over to a weakness, which was his hip and knee flexion. He just went back to his old mechanics and I guess forgot about the drills that we had done. So we see here that hip and knee flexion is a weakness, and his hip lateral rotation and flexion. We see that his knee doesn't bend where I want it to be in his stepping into the throw, so we have to go back with him and do some of the exaggeration drills from the first session. In the third session right here, I did visual modeling to demonstrate them how I want them to laterally rotate their hip in order to get depth in their throw. So when we start off the drill. In the fourth instructional session, I also did equipment modification. So I had them use a towel instead of a football to focus on their follow through. So right here we get to see George demonstrating where and how he's going to have to pronate that the radial ulnar joint. We got session 4 with Julian. And again, the one weakness with Julian at this point is just his hip lateral rotation and flexion. It's getting there, but it is not up to the standard, which is still why I had to categorize it as a weakness. So just a couple more drills with him, and I feel like he should have 5 out of the 5 critical features as strengths. Obviously, since he only has one weakness from the critical features, he has the other 4 still remaining as strengths. We still see it in the video. Ball security is good. Hip and knee flexion, external rotation and abduction, as well with pronation and extension of that elbow. George at this point, he pretty much has all 5 critical features as strengths. And I expected that from him early because, again, he used to play football, so he pretty much just needed a refresher on how to do these drills. We see right there his hip lateral rotation and flexion to be able to get depth. That was pretty much his only weakness in the previous session, so now he has all 5 critical features as strengths and no weaknesses, which at this point I am really happy with him because all we have to focus on is him being able to complete 50 to 70% of his throws, which right now he's right at that 50% mark. So again, I'm just hoping that he rises and gets it closer to 70. With Miguel, we see that he now fixed his hip and knee flexion, which he had lost in the previous video, and he converted that now into one of his strengths. So he, again, just like George and Julian, has met the 4 out of the 5 critical features as strengths, and we are just lacking that hip lateral rotation and flexion, which again, if we continue to work on the couple drills and a new drill that I use for the fifth instructional session, he should be having, just like George, 5 out of the 5 critical features as strengths. And here in the 5th session, instructional session, I modified the task. So what I did, I set up cones to kind of, so that they can see visually how far they should have their depth, which will help them with their hip lateral rotation and flexion when they start. And this is a comparison from day 1 to day 5 with all the participants. We start with Julian in day 1. We saw 4 critical features as weaknesses and only 1 as strength. And by the 5th session, he pretty much had all 5 down. We see his hip lateral rotation and flexion, elbow flexion here securing the ball, hip and knee flexion stepping in, external rotation and abduction of the shoulders throwing, and his pronation and his follow through. George, again, he used to play, so by session 4, he was already having all 5 of the critical features down as strengths. And we continue to see that in the 5th session. What I did notice with both George and Julian, they met also the completion percentage goal. Julian was right at the 55 to 60 mark, and George exceeded, going all the way to the 80% mark. Miguel was the biggest shocker. He started off not knowing how to throw a football, and he really surprised. He worked hard and really got to complete this goal as well. Right away, we set that hip lateral flexion as a strength. We see his elbow flexion as a strength. He met all 5 critical features as strengths, and he was able to complete 50% of his throws, which made me really proud of him. I am proud to say that each participant met the goal that was set to them. Each participant hit 5 out of the 5 critical features. Julian completed 60%, George completed 80%, and Miguel 50% of their throws. Thank you guys so much for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed.